What is evidence-based practice? Evidence-based practice is comprised of two different but related concepts. The first concept is a process, a way of asking questions and then going about finding the answer to those questions. It's a process for making decisions about client care, developing different programs, evaluating policy options, and it's a way of asking questions of both the literature and your clients, taking the difference between the literature and your client's experience and melding them together in a systematic way. Another way the phrase evidence-based practice is used is as a stamp of approval for particular interventions that have been tested empirically over and over and over using the best quality scientific approaches to answer questions about effectiveness. So for example, assertive community treatment is an intervention for people with severe and persistent mental illness that are living in community-based settings that involves teams of social workers, nurses, and physicians going out regularly and addressing the needs of clients who live in these community-based settings. There's been a number of studies of these interventions, of assertive community treatment interventions, and those studies have found that assertive community treatment reduces hospitalization and might have some other benefits for clients. And so we call assertive community treatment an evidence-based practice. It has a stamp of approval of the research literature. So evidence-based practice is both a process, a way of knowing about the world, asking informed questions, and getting good answers. But it's also a stamp of approval that has happened after different interventions have gone through those processes and have been evaluated and determined to have evidence supporting them. There's a number of compendiums of information and assignment number one, the research team assignment number one, will deal with you going to one of these compendiums of information that attempt to decide what programs are evidence-based and what programs are not evidence-based. And we're going to ask you to think through how those different websites come to conclusions about the effectiveness of different interventions. I've been using evidence-based practice and the scientific method as somewhat interchangeable, and that's because in many respects, evidence-based practice is a formalization of the scientific method as it applies to clinical care. And what we're going to be focused on here is a set of ideas that are core to the scientific method and core to evidence-based practice. First, all information, all knowledge is refutable. There is no source of information that should not be subject to tests or refutation. This is why we're so critical of authority-based approaches to clinical care, where the authority says, do it this way because this is the way to do it. We need to be asking questions about why we do it that way, and is this the most effective way to do it? We have responsibilities to our clients to ask good questions about whether we're delivering the best possible care. And as a core of that, all knowledge must be subject to refutation. We privilege empirical knowledge, or knowledge based on observations in controlled settings, over stories of clients or opinions of people that are in positions of power or authority, or notions like common sense. And this is core to the whole idea of evidence-based practice, because we need to rely on the evidence. The evidence is always flawed. The evidence is always going to have problems. But we can use our clinical judgment, our experience, and the evidence to make the most and best informed decisions about our client. But the core there is that we incorporate the available evidence even when that evidence contradicts what we want to believe. The key to quality evidence, though, is not just a story by some client or some fancy statistical analysis published in a journal, but a very specific set of systematic approaches to gathering that evidence and reporting on that evidence. And it's these systematic approaches that we're going to be spending the bulk of our time learning about and understanding, so that we can critique the evidence and make informed decisions about what is good quality evidence and what is poor quality evidence. We've now developed a model of evidence-based practice that's comprised of 3 overlapping diagrams. You as a clinician are going to develop clinical experience. You're going to develop a sense of understanding of your clients based on intuition and observation, and you will have a lot of very specific knowledge about the contingencies and the experiences and the world in which your clients live. You will then, through the time in this class, begin to evaluate and appraise the evidence about what the most effective solutions are for your client. Now, the research evidence is not going to talk about your client specifically. You know the most about your client. The research evidence will say what we as a group know about populations and how assertive community treatment works in that population, or how cognitive behavioral therapy or motivational interviewing or family reunification or a whole host of other interventions that we use in social work will be either effective or have strengths or weaknesses within the population that you're interested in. And as a practitioner of evidence-based practice, you will be able to apply the research evidence and integrate it with your clinical knowledge. But there's another piece to this, which is understanding your client's preferences. Because often the research evidence doesn't tell us what we should do in an absolute sense. It gives us a sense of this sometimes works better than this. It might improve this domain, but not that domain. And that's where understanding and incorporating client preferences into the treatments that we do is essential. And so the idea behind evidence-based practice is to take our clients' preferences, what our clients want to get out of the experience, with our clinical knowledge and the research evidence, and integrate those. And the areas where they overlap are the core of evidence-based practice. One of the core concepts that science attempts to establish and understand is the question of causality. Does performing cognitive behavioral therapy cause a reduction in depression symptoms in clients? Does assertive community treatment reduce hospitalization? Does family reunification lead to better child outcomes? We're making causal statements when we say doing X causes Y. And the whole point of the scientific approach to experiments, research design, statistical analysis, interpretation of data is to unpeel the world, the onion of the world, in a way to begin to see the causal relationships between what we do as social workers and the outcomes that we're interested in. The problem is establishing these causal relationships is incredibly difficult. And we're going to be spending a lot of time this semester talking about where we can make causal statements, where we can't make causal statements, and how we can begin to pull apart some of these studies to see where they're providing evidence that intervention X causes good outcome Y. There are several things that we have to establish in order to determine whether there is a causal relationship. First, there has to be a correlation between X and Y. If there's no relationship between cognitive behavioral therapy and depression symptoms, then there can't be a causal relationship. There has to be some form of association between them or correlation. The thing that we're doing, which we're going to call the independent variable, the intervention that we're using, that's the independent variable in this context, must occur before the dependent variable. You cannot hit a pitch if you swing before the pitch is thrown. You can only hit the pitch after the pitch is thrown. So the independent variable has to occur before the dependent variable. In this case, we're talking about outcomes like reduced depression symptoms or reduced hospitalizations in assertive community treatment. So the independent variable has to precede in time the dependent variable. There has to be a relationship between the independent and dependent variable, and the independent variable has to occur in time before the dependent variable. The other thing is that the relationship can't be spurious. It can't be convenient or just happen as a happenstance. There are many ways in which we can see a relationship between X and Y, have Y precede X in time, and yet be wrong about this association. Let me give you an example. Years ago, I was involved in a study where we were trying to understand whether supportive housing reduced use of emergency rooms in a local hospital. we only had data from this one hospital, and so we took the data and we lined it up over time, how many of our clients were in the emergency room at a particular day. We put a marker at the point in time where our clients got supportive housing, and then we saw, did their use of the emergency room go up, stay flat, or go down? Well, lo and behold, their emergency room use went way down. We were super excited until we realized that what had actually happened is that there was an ambulance diversion program going on during that same time. And so our clients were being sent to other hospitals that we didn't have data from. So it wasn't actually, so there was a relationship, right? We had a reduction in the use of emergency rooms by our clients after they had gotten the intervention. So the intervention came before, the good outcome came after. There was a relationship between the good outcome and our intervention. But it wasn't because of our intervention, it was because of something else that happened. And we're going to spend time identifying those threats to internal validity of studies, that's what we're going to call it. And it also speaks, though, to the importance of very specific sets of methods to deal with this question of causality.